This is the KGOU Readers Club, and I'm managing editor Logan Layden. Well, it seemed appropriate to step back to a book and a conversation originally had on this program about 2 years ago about the history of football at the University of Oklahoma and legendary coach Bud Wilkinson. It's Bud Wilkinson and the Rise of Oklahoma Football from OU Press and author John Scott. John Scott, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, glad to be here.
And good to have you in person here in studio. We've done the Readers Club in the past where we've had people come in via Zoom, and it can offer some technical difficulties. Less so whenever you're sitting 3 feet away from me here.
Makes it easier.
Yes, indeed. First, before we get into all the details of the history of Bud Wilkinson and his legendary status here at the University of Oklahoma, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your connection to the Oklahoma football program and what brought you to putting this book together?
Well, my first recollection of Oklahoma football is 1954. I was 8 years old, and I remember reading in magazine articles about OU. And it wasn't until 1955, when I was 9, that I have memories. I watched OU football games. So my experience with it goes a long way back. And I don't know that I ever thought I'd write a book about it. But what happened was that after OU won Switzer won his third national championship in '85, I got with a friend of mine who's an artist named J. O'Melia and talked about the idea of putting together a coffee table book that would have his paintings, his pictures of famous OU players, and then I would write stuff to go around it. And so we talked to the people who owned the Tulsa Tribune at that time, and they saw it as a great opportunity to sell a book that would be sort of a corporate Christmas gift, that kind of thing. And we all thought it would work out well, and we started. What we didn't know was that the price of oil would drop to about $12 the same year we started. And eventually it got to the point that the people at Tribune Swab Fox said, let's forget this. We're not going to pay the money to have it printed and then not have a market anymore. And so it was, sort of hidden away in their files, so to speak, until 1997, when they allowed me to purchase the rights to the manuscript. And so I owned it, but it was not in the shape I would want. And so I went through, and as I had time, I would go in and edit and revise, and if I found out new things, I'd add them to the story. And eventually got it in the place I wanted it in last year, 2021. And it turned out that OU Press was interested in publishing it. So it was a long time, I can assure you. But there were times that, real life raised its ugly head, and I had to do other things to make a living and keep going.
Well, that's just, it's one of the, this is a great historical overview of the rise of Oklahoma football in the program, and we're going to talk about that. But the book itself, just the sort of length of time it took, the long road it took to get published just last year on a book that you started working on in the mid-'80s. And one of the things that's so interesting about it is Bud Wilkinson himself was actually, he's read this. He approved at least some form of the manuscript while he was still alive, right?
That's true, Logan.
Yeah.
I interviewed him in the summer, fall of 1986. By that time, he had moved to St. Louis, where he coached in the NFL for 2 years, and then went into other forms of business, but he had an office on the Hill, the Italian section of St. Louis. And so we spent an entire week. He'd come pick me up at the hotel, and we'd talk football all day. So there were about 5 days that I had him, and we talked face to face. And as a result, I was able to learn things from him that go beyond who won and who lost and what was the score. That's easy to find. But understanding why Bud did these things, that's the thing that was fascinating to me, was why did he do things the way he did them? Clearly, when you look back on the course of college football, he did things different, and he did them better than most everybody else. And when he showed up at OU was sort of a mediocre football program, and he was able to change it. And so he told me the story, and then I created the manuscript he was able to see and reviewed it in 1987, and then by 1988 he said, it's okay.
What were your impressions? What was he like to be around? Can you describe his personality? What kind of person was Bud Wilkinson just to interact with in such a way?
Well, if anyone has ever seen the Bud Wilkinson TV shows or old versions of it, I can tell you that Bud Wilkinson is just like that, only better. He is one of those people that, unlike what they say about meeting people that you admire, don't, because you'll find they have feet of clay. I didn't check Bud's feet, but I can tell you that he was magnanimous and open and a joy to visit with in person.
That was one of the things that I found interesting about the book. You have this sort of idea, and someone like me who's looking back at this earlier time in football, and you sort of have an idea that these coaches, they're dictatorial. If you're thinking of a football coach in the 1950s, you're thinking about someone who's, well, he's a real hard ass, and and all this was not quite how you would describe Bud Wilkinson. A lot of the people around him, a lot of people who influenced him were, but he was a little different character.
He was different, and that was one of the things that made him so interesting, was that he wasn't loud and he wasn't demeaning, but he was a perfectionist, and all the assistant coaches and players would tell you that. He expected them to perform, and he expected them to play their very best. I don't know if you've heard about the sign that he put in the OU locker room in 1948, and it says, "Play like a champion today." And his belief was that it is by doing that every day, whether it's the practice field or it's in a real game, that's how you become as good a football player as you can become. And if every one of the players makes that commitment, it will make the team better.
That is actually something I wanted to ask you specifically about. That sign, the "Play Like a Champion Today" sign.
Yes.
That all the players hit as they come out onto the field. If you've seen, Rudy, Notre Dame has that sign, right?
They have a copy of that sign.
Who did it first?
Bud did, by about 30 years.
Okay.
And, maybe 40. He did it in 1948. Lou Holtz and Notre Dame began to think that they wanted that sign in about 1986. So they were copying, and it was Bud who did the board in the locker room way before Notre Dame.
Fascinating. Yes, indeed. People, that's almost like an iconic Notre Dame thing, but nope. That started here in Norman with Bud Wilkinson.
Started with Bud Wilkinson.
Yeah. Let's talk about his early life and coming up and how he was shaped by World War II, just like anyone or most people in that generation. He fought in the war. He was in the Navy, right?
Yes, he was in the Navy.
But even during that time when he was on the Enterprise, I believe in his spare time, he was, jotting down football plays and things like this. This was a passion for him. And actually during the war, is that where his coaching career sort of began, these flight schools? Can you explain a little bit? It was this idea, it was part of their training.
It was.
Right?
When it became clear that the world was probably headed into World War II, some people in the Navy decided that the thing that needed to be done was to find out who was competitive and who was not. All these people who were going into flight school, and it cost about $250,000 in 1940-some to train a pilot for combat. And so you wanted to make sure you had the guys who had the stuff. They were going to be able to deal with combat situations, and as you would see in the movies or whatever, in terms of aerial combat, there are no rules. Mm-hmm. And you've got to want it bad. And so they started a program called Pre-Flight, Navy Pre-Flight. And the idea was that they would spend 12 weeks getting in physical and mental shape to be a combat pilot. This program had nothing to do with the actual training that came later for the people who passed the competitiveness test. And so there were 4 of these pre-flight places throughout the U.S. Bud went to Iowa pre-flight. And there it was coached by a coach named Don Farreau, who was the football coach at the University of Missouri. And Missouri had good teams, but not great teams. But Don Farreau had devised a new formation called the split T. Mm-hmm. Now, when Bud was playing at Minnesota in 1930s, people were running the single wing, which was the dominant formation of the time, and looked a lot like what the shotgun does now. The other thing they had was the T formation, and there their quarterback would get the ball from the center in his hands directly without it going through the air. And there were some who were successful with that. The thing, though, that Don Farreau figured out was that both of those formations had linemen standing shoulder to shoulder, very tight. You may have seen pictures of old football, and the linemen are just right next to each other. Don Farreau figured out that if you separate them by 3 to 4 feet, then the defense has to spread wider in order to cover the field. And as a result, you didn't have to push people out of the way, defenders. The hole was already there. You just had to keep it open. And that's what Bud Wilkinson learned from Don Farreau.
And yeah, we're going to talk about some of the innovations as we get Bud Wilkinson to the University of Oklahoma. It's John Scott with me, the author of Bud Wilkinson and the Rise of Oklahoma Football on the KGOU Readers Club. I'm Logan Layden. We'll be back with you after this short break on KGOU, your NPR source. with the KGOU Readers Club. I'm managing editor Logan Layden. If you miss any of today's program or previous episodes of the KGOU Readers Club, let me encourage you to visit our website, kgou.org, click on the Programs tab, and then on KGOU Readers Club, it's where you can hear this edition and all the others we've done over the past 3 years. For this episode, I'm joined by John Scott, the author of Bud Wilkinson and the Rise of Oklahoma Football from OU Press. During the original broadcast of this program, we got a question from a listener about recruitment as it relates to Prentice Gott and personal and professional costs that impacted Coach Wilkinson as he integrated the OU football program. This was the first African-American player at the University of Oklahoma. Bud Wilkinson from the Midwest. And I just wonder, before we get into the details of that, if you could speak just a little bit to how big a deal that was and how he handled it, and we'll talk about it more here in a bit.
It was a very big deal, and Bud had grown up in Minnesota and played in the Big Ten. And Big Ten schools had black players long ago. Iowa had one about the turn of the century, but the schools in the Big Ten had black players, and the world didn't end, and Bud knew that. Oklahoma, on the other hand, was part of the rest of the South where there were no black players. Now, a couple had tried in 53, 54, but they weren't good enough or got hurt. So he wasn't technically, Prentice Gott wasn't technically the first to be at OU. He probably was the first to appear in an OU uniform because the others didn't get there. At the time, Bud believed that the most important thing he could do in his life, in his career, was integrate the athletic program at the University of Oklahoma. He went into that specifically with a goal. And on the other hand, he knew he'd have to find the right person. Anybody who knows the story of Jackie Robinson and the fact that what they had to overcome off the field was more difficult than anything he had to overcome on the field. And so Bud was aware of Prentice. Prentice was a fullback at Douglas High School. And he was the best player in the state. And so Bud got with the members of the black community, doctors and pharmacists and what of all, and dentists, and said, if I try to offer Prentice a scholarship, and he's certainly good enough for one, the problem will be that there will be people who will resent that. On the other hand, if we get him in the University of Oklahoma and then he earns a scholarship, it won't be as big a deal. So the people in the Medifar organization collected $4,000 to let Prentice attend the University of Oklahoma. Now, just like Bud suspected, once he got here and was enrolled and playing football, he did demonstrate very quickly that he should be at the University of Oklahoma. Now, it took a while, not only for the fans to accept it, but it also took a while for some of the players, many of whom who'd grown up in Texas or Oklahoma rural areas, did not take to Prentice well. But that was the minority. And so he came and he became a star at OU and played on the varsity in 57, 58, and 59. And then went on to play in the NFL with the St. Louis Cardinals. But that was the thing that Bud saw as more important than anything else. He didn't particularly care about his records. He thought that his records will be forgotten. He said, in 100 years, no one will care about my records. Now, it's been 60 of them, and people are still paying attention, but he did not see that as the main reason he was in football.
Yeah, and I mean, that speaks to kind of his larger character a little bit, and we've talked about this on our own. Just for Bud Wilkinson, college football was a big passion, but it was not the end-all, be-all for, or at least what he thought, for his players or for himself, actually. Even though he was super passionate about it, there was life beyond football. That seems to be sort of a consistent theme throughout the book, that he always, and even whenever he eventually leaves OU, it's just like, well, I've accomplished what I set out to, and it's time to move on to something else, which it's different now.
Well, it is and it isn't. Tom Osborne, if you remember him, at the University of Nebraska, coached for a number of years and then got elected to Congress. Mm-hmm. But Bud was early into the idea that football was not the be-all and end-all of life. His father was a mortgage banker in Minneapolis, and what he did was run a savings and loan, just like you see in movies, the one with Jimmy Stewart at Christmas. Mm-hmm. And that's the sort of thing that his father ran. His father wanted him to come into business and take it on. The point you make is that Bud was not excited by that. He loved football, and although he probably didn't know how long his coaching career would last, he went into it because he loved football, loved the whole business of how you run a football team and create a good football team. And it wasn't until 1963, the year he retired, or that was his last season. His brother died in 1963. Senator Kerr from Oklahoma died, and Kennedy was killed. So that's when Bud finally said to himself, there's more to life than football. Mm-hmm. And that's when he decided to run for Congress.
Yeah, and of course he had served somewhat in the Kennedy administration, right?
Yes, he did.
And we're talking about sort of later in his coaching career. Let's step back, for a few minutes. I do want to talk about his rise at Oklahoma. In those first few years, and the way your book is laid out is very chronological in the 5 different parts, and it starts with the victorious veterans. These were World War II veterans.
They were World War II veterans.
And they probably should have won the national championship in the late 40s.
One of the years, 49.
Tell me about those years a little bit, yeah.
Lots of schools came to realize that when the war was over, there would be thousands and thousands of men coming back from the service, going to college, and many of them had played football. And they were a source of older, very fine football players. And so OU was not the only school that saw this as a way to build a football team quickly, although that's what the regents at the University of Oklahoma wanted, was a football team now that gets rid of the Dust Bowl Okie image of the state. And so they said, we're going to find a coach who was involved in the Navy pre-flight program, and he'll bring a lot of players with him. And that happened. And it happened at OU. But one of the things that happened during that time was you had these people who were, many of them would have been in their 20s. They were bigger, stronger, certainly more mature. They'd been in a war. A football game was nothing. And so OU's first team was 1946, and that was the one where Jim Tatum was actually the head coach. Bud came as his assistant. And in 1947, Bud's first year as a coach, OU went 7-2-1. And it changed the whole nature of college football because, as I point out in the book, if you look at the top 10 teams in 1945, it's all the same. It's Notre Dame, it's Ohio State, it's Southern Cal. Beginning in 1947 was the Wilkinson Revolution. And he took these players along with the things he'd learned about the split tee and created a team that from the time he took over until 13 years later, he won the conference every year.
And beat Oklahoma State, Oklahoma A&M, which they went through that transition during that time. That's another interesting thing. Before Bud Wilkinson, the Oklahoma program, am I wrong to say that it was sort of third tier, that like the University of Tulsa and Oklahoma A&M were more prestigious football programs at that time? It's almost unbelievable to imagine at this point.
It is in today's perspective, but at that time, TU had a team that had been to a bowl game 5 years in a row. The OSU team, or Oklahoma A&M at that time, has now been given the national championship designation by the NCAA. So you had those two teams far better than OU. OU was a pretty mediocre program before Tatum and Bud Wilkinson showed up. And they quickly changed that. And that is what made OU football what it is that Bud was so good and so dedicated and understood how to work with football teams that he did things nobody else was doing and created this the rise of OU football, and it is what it is today because of Bud. Now, Switzer and Stoops and Riley built on that, but without Bud, none of this takes place.
No, well, let's not give Lincoln Riley too much credit.
I understand.
Coming up in that, what were, he was so innovative, it sort of changed the game. I mean, football looked very different prior to Bud Wilkinson than post Bud Wilkinson, or at least certainly during the time that he was doing these amazing things. We always hear about the streak of wins, 47 straight wins, right? That's the big famous one. But before that, they had a streak of like 31, wasn't it?
31 games. OU is the only school, Bud the only coach, that has 2 winning streaks in something like the top 15. In Bud's second year, 1948, OU played Santa Clara, which doesn't sound like much now, but had a very good football team at the time. And OU had them down at halftime and let them get away. Santa Clara won. And he was in the locker room and on a far side away from everybody else. And Kurt Gowdy, the famous sports announcer who did baseball and football for years and years, was the OU announcer at that time. And he saw Bud over by himself and went over to sort of console him. He said Bud was in tears. And so Kurt Gowdy tried to console him, and they talked about, we should have won, but we lost. And then Bud said, I'll tell you one thing, we won't lose again for 3 years. And that was absolutely true. The rest of 48, 49, and 50, they won 31 straight games. And were the national champions in 1950. And then they lost to Kentucky in the Sugar Bowl.
And it has Bear Bryant.
Bear Bryant.
Right? Coach
Bear
of
Bryant.
Kentucky. Yeah.
And they were friends, or they knew of each other and then became friends after that football game. Then, after OU lost to Kentucky in 51, 52, 53, they went 16-5-2. And then, in the third game of the 1953 season is when the 47-game win streak started. So Bud Wilkinson had a start like no other coach. Barry Switzer had an impressive start. Bob Stoops did well. He won a national championship second year. Lincoln Riley was doing well. But none of them had a start like Bud Wilkinson.
Yes, indeed. So much more to come on the KGOU Readers Club with author John Scott as we discuss his book, Bud Wilkinson and the Rise of OU Football. Again, I'm KGOU Managing Editor Logan Layden. A short break for us before we continue our conversation here on KGOU, your NPR source. And we're back here on KGOU. It's the KGOU Readers Club, and I'm KGOU Managing Editor Logan Layden. Bud Wilkinson and the Rise of Oklahoma Football. That's the book we're discussing today, and we have its author, John Scott, with us for one more segment. If you weren't with us at the beginning of the hour, this is a book more than 30 years in the making. Bud Wilkinson himself gave the book a look at back in the day. And we're back with John Scott. We just discussed the streak, the famous streak, the national championships, bringing Oklahoma football into prominence, which it was not before he got there. And that's not the end of the story, though. He stays as coach until 1963, and I things begin to change somewhat. You tell a story early in the book, and I can't remember which coach it was for which school, but some of these head coaches would jealously guard their plays, their schemes. They did not want their assistant coaches to get wind of this because they may go find a job at another school and implement that coach's plan there and then beat them. And you start to sort of see some of that. What Wilkinson did at OU, so innovative, so game-changing, it was bound to trickle down eventually. And we start to see that happening toward the second half, I guess, of his career here at Oklahoma. Not that he was upset by that. In fact, you would see former players of his. Darrell Royal sticks out as a main example of that. Of course, the legend for the University of Texas and the Longhorns, the stadium's named after him. But before he was a Longhorn, he was a Sooner and a heck of a big fan of Bud Wilkinson. So it was only a matter of time, I suppose, before some of the innovations that Wilkinson had brought to the game trickled down to other places. And he had quite the coaching tree, as we call it today. Isn't that right?
Oh, he did. And he played at Minnesota for a coach named Bernie Bierman, who was considered one of the greats. In fact, he won 3 national championships in a row back when in the 30s, when you just sort of it was sort of a gentleman's agreement who the national championship.
Yes, and that's as you're talking about that. That's again, as someone, I'm in my sort of late 30s. To look how different the game was back then. They would crown the national championship before the national champion before the bowl game. And in fact, wasn't OU's first national championship. They actually lost the bowl game that year.
That's right. They voted for the national champion before a bowl game was sort of seen as after the season and sort of a reward for the players. And so they would go to these festivals, and it was not seen as part of the season. Well, there were enough of the people who were named national champion and went to the bowl game and then lost that people began to say, well, let's change that. In fact, that was one of the things that Bud told his players in 1955 when they were the national champions, is that seldom does the team that win the national championship win a bowl game.
Mm-hmm.
This is your chance to prove that you are worthy of that honor. And then they kicked Maryland. But it was a time when things were indeed different. The coach you're talking about is a fellow named Francis Schmidt, who was the coach at Ohio State when Bud's number one assistant, Gomer Jones, played there. He was a lineman. And Francis Schmidt did exactly what you described. He had this playbook, and he would never let the other coaches see the plays because he was concerned that they would take the plays and use them against him. One of the things that was absolutely different was that Bud didn't believe that. He said, I want coaches who are going to be head coaches someday. I don't want career assistants. And so he was very open. They talked about everything before OU did it in terms of practice and game strategy and things like that.
Well, yeah, and one of the things I did want to discuss with you before we talk, because I do want to talk a little bit about Bud Wilkinson's post-football life, but some of the similarities that we see in the game today versus back in the 50s, early 60s, whenever Wilkinson's sort of head coaching career was starting to wind down somewhat. We get very freaked out today about players leaving their school to go play for another school, transferring to other schools, and conference realignment, and the consequences of that. It's I've heard people describe the current college football atmosphere as the kind of the Wild West. If you go back to this period in history of college football, it wasn't that dissimilar to some of the things we're seeing today, at least.
Well, it was and it wasn't. The thing that made the difference is that in the time we're talking about, particularly in the years Bud coached in the 40s and 50s, college football players were really college students. They were there to get an education. Now, they were like Bud. They loved the game of football. But there was no money in pro football at that time. Now, Bud was an All-American playing for Minnesota, and he was offered $3,500 to play for the Green Bay Packers. He was offered $3,600 to become an assistant coach at Syracuse, and that's what he decided to do, because it's not like today. Pro football players, particularly linemen, in those days didn't make any money. And they might have a fancy car, but they had nothing in their pockets to spend on anything else. So it was a different time. They were looking to get an education, and they just loved football. So Bud, who was of the same mind, because he loved football, set that kind of tone at Oklahoma. He wanted to make sure that the players graduated. And so you really didn't have much of that going on because the money was not there to transfer. Well, the rules didn't allow it, but there was no money in pro football, so the allure of doing that was not like it is now. That's the big difference.
And he was quite loyal to Oklahoma. I mean, that's something that I've always thought. But then as I read the book as well, he never did really, we talk about Lincoln Riley and the fact that he left Oklahoma to go to USC. Bud Wilkinson, too, would always entertain the prospect of perhaps going somewhere else. I can remember at one point, didn't they wanted him as the coach of Texas, the Naval Academy. He never just said outright. There were a couple of times in his career where the university president, George Lynn Cross at the time, right, would basically have to sort of sit down with him in the library and have a bourbon there at the president's house and talk this through and convince him to stay. One of the things that Bud did that was so unusual was the fact that he considered a coach's contract a real contract. Many times, as you see, and it's going on between OU and USC and others, the contract is there to protect the coach from being fired on a whim. But coaches, by and large, have seen the opportunity to take advantage of that. Bud didn't. Bud at one time had a 10-year contract. At the time, there were people at the University of Texas who wanted him to come there. And there were some rumors and all kinds of goings on, and what Bud said was, no, I have a contract at the University of Oklahoma, and I will fulfill that contract. And he did. It was the way it always was. But he also believed and would explain to Dr. Cross that if a coach's name doesn't come up in all this kind of speculation, it's a sign that their stock is going down. So you didn't necessarily pretend to be interested, but you didn't get too upset if your name was bandied around, even though you had no intention of leaving. So eventually, it comes to an end. It's 1963, Wilkinson's last season at OU. Is that right?
Yes.
And they had relative success, not the national championship glory of the 50s, I suppose, but he sort of left on top, right? It seemed
yes,
like
he did.
He left the program in a good place. And of course, we've seen the coaches, since then that we've talked about before, and Oklahoma has never fully left prominence since then. I guess the early 90s weren't that great.
Yeah, the 90s looked a whole lot like OU in the 30s.
Yeah, but we came back, and Wilkinson left. We're talking about in another parallel to football nowadays. We get very excited about these young coaches. Oh, Lincoln Riley's 35 years old. We've got this 36-year-old coach. Wilkinson was 31 when he took over at OU. By the time he left, he was still in his 40s, right?
Yes. Technically, Bud was 3 months before his 31st birthday. He was still technically 30 when he was named the coach at OU. Now, that was young then. It would be young now.
Sure.
But he had that kind of aura about him that the regents and Dr. Cross wanted him to be the coach regardless of his age. And when he was offered the job, that was the one thing that Bud had some hesitation about. Was he old enough? Because other OU coaches learned this lesson about not jumping too soon. Switzer, for instance, didn't become the coach at OU until he was 35. When Bob became the head coach at OU, he was 39 because he was an assistant coach at places like Kansas State and Florida, and so there was plenty of money. You don't want to leave that for not a good job. And so it was a different time, and many of them have followed in Bud's example because Switzer came to OU, retired from OU. Same thing with Bob Stoops. They did not jump.
So Wilkinson stops being the head coach of Oklahoma there in the early mid-'60s. I know he did some coaching in the NFL
Yes.
briefly for a couple of years, but aside from that, what you got basically, and he had basically the whole second half of his life left. What did he do after that? And when you encountered him, whenever you were talking to him about this book, what was his job? Like, what was his career?
What was his
after
job?
that? Yeah.
Well, at that time, he was involved in the insurance business. And that's one of the things that makes Bud's story so different, is that he had other alternatives, and he knew it. He had to choose being a football coach. And one of the things his dad told him was, you can be a football coach if you want, but just remember, sooner or later, lots of people at a university want somebody else. And so Bud always remembered that. And after he ran for the Senate in 1964 and lost, he had to create a new life. And so he began working with the Lifetime Sports Foundation, which was put together by Voight, and make basketballs and volleyballs and stuff like that. And then he became the #1 color commentator on ABC football games, because he was so much more articulate than some of the ones they had, and he had real ethos. When he said, well, this is how it's likely to be, people could believe it because he'd proved it.
Oh, and he was a pioneer on that front too when it comes to being a public football coach. We are running out of time. Bud Wilkinson and the Rise of Oklahoma Football. It's from OU Press. Well, certainly I recommend it. I learned so much about the history of OU football through this book, and it's so unique, the fact that you were able to interact with the man himself. John Scott, thanks for joining me this afternoon. I appreciate it. I think we perhaps need to probably talk more, because we've just barely scratched the surface here.
That sounds great, Logan. I'd be glad to talk more.
That's John Scott, everyone. The book, once again, is Bud Wilkinson and the Rise of Oklahoma Football. Again, if you missed any of today's program or previous episodes of the KGOU Readers Club, head to our website, kgou.org. There you can click on the Programs tab and then on KGOU Readers Club, where you can hear this edition and all the others we've done over the past several years. And thanks for joining me, KGOU Managing Editor Logan Layden, for the KGOU Readers Club.